Hello and welcome to 2021's third edition of Extra Shot, the programme that pours silky smooth debate over the steaming hot telecoms topic du jour. My name is Maistre, I'm the editorial director at TelecomTV, and I'm here to host the programme that takes a look back at some of the themes from our recent Open Telco Summit. I am, as is customary on these visits to our digital caffeine parlour, accompanied by my partners in froth, TelecomTV's Director of Content, Guy Daniels, and Chris Lewis, MD of Lewis Insight, who likes a cup of joe when he's out riding through the English countryside on his tandem. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show. Chris, with lockdown now eased in the UK, have you frequented any particular coffee outlets recently on your two-wheel travels? Or with the pubs once again open, have you turned into a bit of a beer monster?
Do you know, Ray, thank you for asking. I did find a particularly nice coffee shop in the yard of a farm down in Surrey Hills where the coffee was served out of a horse box and you sat on bales of straw to consume the drink. Stunning.
Wow. Fantastic. That sounds like we'll get the address and coordinates from you afterwards. I do like a
I don't know where it is.
Of equestrian. Yeah, it was somewhere. The Surrey Hills, you were told. Yeah.
Exactly. Fantastic. I was just taken there.
Yeah. And Guy, what's staining the bottom of your cup this month?
Well, Ray, it's a single origin Peruvian bean from deepest, darkest Peru, which is perfect with a marmalade sandwich.
Bear with. Okay, we'll be talking more about warm and wet drinky poos with our special guests soon enough. But first, let's set the scene for today's programme. We recently held the Open Telco Summit, during which a motley crew of industry experts discussed all manner of open networking, open source and open culture topics, some of which we'll delve into further today. And I'm going to be picky. The first topic is open source, which for Brits might sound like something you put on your sausage sandwich. Alas not. So to get the ball rolling, let's hear from our first special guest, Susan James from Red Hat, starting with her hot beverage preferences. Is she a coffee or a tea fan?
So it depends on the time of day. I drink coffee during the day in the morning, and right now I'm drinking a cup of black coffee. So yeah, I'm a black coffee that can't be instant. And in the evenings I drink peppermint tea.
Well, I'm very glad that Susan qualified herself there and mentioned that instant coffee was a no-no, as it is across the TelecomTV community. That meant she passed our test and was eligible to get an industry question. So I asked her if she thought that the telecom sector is taking open source seriously enough.
I would say absolutely. I mean, it's prevalent in all of the networks with things like Linux. And we're seeing, OpenStack has been adopted quite widely with NFV, and Kubernetes is becoming throughout all of the telco industry in the OSS, BSS, and into the networks now. So absolutely, I think telecom is taking open source seriously.
Well, that's a lot of major developments right there, especially when you look at virtualization and telco cloud strategies. Chris, is open source now part of the telecoms furniture? And is it a given that open source thinking is part and parcel of any major telecoms initiative? How different are things from, say, 10 years ago?
Oh, I think it's shifted enormously in the last 10 years, Ray. The fact that when we're discussing these issues, we get industry members, of course, from the supply side developing the software. But in most of the initiatives, we see telco representation indeed often driving a lot of the activities. And that willingness to embrace openness in its broadest sense, I think is evident in many of the discussions we have on all these different conference and discussion platforms. So yes, it's part of the furniture. The beauty of it, it's sort of that flexible furniture that we can move around and put into whatever configuration we want to have to suit our own purposes.
Okay, yeah, excellent point about the involvement of the network operators there, and I wish I had some of that furniture you just mentioned, I have to say. So Guy, you're an open source fanboy as well as being partial to some hot source. Can you see open source developments dominating telecoms R&D at any stage?
Well, yes, I like to fly the flag for open source. I don't think open source is seen as 100% essential by the telcos. I mean, unlike the wider enterprise sector, where I think it gets far greater support. And open source is more popular, or at least seen as more applicable in the operations and support system side of telcos. Yes, it's being used in networking, but only partially. And I think it's very much being used to help solve specific problems. So in answer to your question, will open source developments dominate telecoms R&D? I think they'll probably play a greater role in the years to come, with telcos bolting together a number of focused open source networking projects, and many of which, of course, they'll have been instrumental in creating in the first place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That sounds on the money there. And of course, we're seeing a lot of these kind of involvements and developments in some of the industry fora that we track and write about and talk about. Okay, time to move on now and consider some open architecture issues. Open RAN has been a massive topic in the past year or so, and now we're seeing operators, the greenfield players such as Rakuten Mobile and Dish notwithstanding, edging closer to some meaningful activity. And it seems like for many, the adoption of virtual RAN architectures will be a logical step towards open RAN in major markets. So I had a quick chat with Wind River CTO Paul Miller about this topic and trend. But first, of course, I tapped into his hot beverage options. Is he in the coffee camp or in the tea camp, or neither?
Well, I would say my favorite coffee is definitely Kona. That dates back to when my wife and I were fortunate enough to visit Hawaii, and we really enjoyed the experience, and the coffee there was so fantastic, and so it remains my favorite.
Not only do I love it when people get excited about their coffee traits, but I love it even more when they get geo-specific. I mean, Hawaii, what a lovely vision that is. Chris, have you ever had a hot cup of Hawaiian?
I've not, Ray, no, but I think one of the beauties of the coffee market as it exists today is you can get choices from pretty much anywhere in the world where coffee's produced. So I do take great joy out of ordering things from different places.
Yeah, absolutely. I think closest I've got to that is a pizza, I think, so far, but I do need to check out those coffee beans that increasing numbers of people are being fans of. Okay, so I went on to ask Paul if he thought the industry is on the verge of a virtual RAN revolution. And here's what he had to say.
Yeah, Ray, great question. I think with respect to vRAN, we're certainly on the cusp of a major transformation in the industry. We've seen that obviously the disaggregation that started with NFV enables the service providers to have a unique and powerful commercial position that extends beyond just the initial design-in of the network, which is where the legacy monolithic appliance-based approach would have its competition, to now with a fully virtualized vRAN, that competition will extend year after year, right? That enables the carrier to hold the vendors accountable at the infrastructure layers as well as the application layers. And so that's a real compelling business reason why this is happening. The other thing is obviously applications, right? If you have a monolithic bespoke appliance, it's very difficult or impossible to deploy edge-based applications to it. And we know that one of the real emerging interests for a carrier with 5G is the new revenue streams that can be created through things like autonomous vehicle applications and industrial automation at the far edge, private 5G, et cetera, augmented reality. And we've seen a lot of those applications taking hold. And if you do that with a non-virtualized RAN, then you don't have the fully distributed cloud infrastructure you need to host those applications. So we think the vRAN and 5G is the business case enabler for the building of a fully distributed cloud that then makes a service provider have core to edge full virtualization to launch applications and build new revenue streams. So vRAN is pretty exciting, and undoubtedly it's taking hold as a fully virtualized approach.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Guy, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think it's the Wild West out there at the distributed edge. You know, you can see all these prospectors piling in, digging around, seeing what riches they can mine. There's so many options for technology and software choices, you know, platforms and operating systems, what have you. As for the mobile RAN, if you want an open RAN, you need a virtual RAN. You need to virtualize the baseband. You have to disaggregate. And whether that means mixing up your supplier roster or sticking with your current preferred partner, well, that's up to you. I hope we're on the verge of a virtual RAN revolution, because that will help start an open RAN revolution. And who doesn't like a revolution or two?
Or three, in fact. Yeah, and I think we are starting to see this now, and I think there's pressure from the vendor side as well, or I would say not pressure, but availability from the vendor side to make this happen. And Chris, is virtualizing the RAN the best first step for brownfield traditional mobile network operators as they consider open networks?
Well, I think Guy touched upon it then. It depends on your attitude to your supplier roster. We're very conscious of them working with the traditional suppliers and working with those under the virtualization of that environment. So yes, of course, it's part of the thinking, because we want the flexibility in there. We want to benefit from the technology that's out there in terms of virtualization. But is it absolutely critical at this stage? I think there are bigger issues to deal with across the telecom sector, to be honest. Not least of which is just getting the services pitched right to the audience they're trying to address, rather than focusing inwardly on these issues, which are often, by the way, to go back to your Open RAN comment, perhaps slightly farther in the future than many people think about today, given the amount of coverage that we've had on this subject.
Right. Yes. I mean, we're at the very early stages. I mean, in the same breath, very often we're sometimes talking about 6G. So this very much is the beginning of quite a long journey. And as you point out, and as many telcos like to say, with these things, they're gradually changing the wheels on their vehicles while they're still driving down the highway. So it's a tricky thing to think about. And somebody, of course, always has to be there first. And of course, the enabling capabilities for vRAN are very much edge-based, and the same IT resources can, under the right circumstances, also be used to support the disaggregation of the fixed access broadband network, which is a resource path being taken, for example, by Deutsche Telekom. But are open architectures limited to just the access network, or can they also extend to the transport network side of things? I checked in with Tim Dwaran, Senior Director of Solutions Marketing at Infinera, on this topic. But first, I quizzed him on his drinking habits. Is he a coffee or a tea person?
Most of the time, I'm a coffee fan. And my coffee selection is probably some kind of a dark roast. I've spent some time in Hawaii, and so I like some coffees that come out of Hawaii or Indonesia, like Sumatra. That part of the planet seems to be coffee, a flavor that is pleasing to my palate.
What is going on here? Is there some kind of secret Hawaiian coffee cult in the telecom sector that no one's told us about? Are we behind the trend? I can't imagine that. I mean, I think I recall cult CEO Kerry Gilder also eulogizing about Hawaiian coffee. Guy, do you think a field trial, a field trip is in order?
I think you're right, Ray. And I'm starting to get concerned. I've checked with my local roaster chums up here, and there's not a Hawaiian bean to be had anywhere. So you're right. I think perhaps we should hold the next great telco debate in Hawaii and experience those magic beans firsthand.
Absolutely. Let's book that in for 2025. Absolutely. And in the meantime, I think we should be getting Chris to source us some of those lovely Hawaiian beans. And now I also spoke with Tim about networks, of course, even though I'm now completely and utterly discombobulated. And I asked him, is open networking applicable to open and data transport networks, or really only suitable for radio and fixed broadband access networks?
So open networking is applicable to a broad range of product categories, including optical and data transport. However, the way a product category is open and disaggregated certainly varies. As an example, in data transport, we're separating the network operating system from the underlying merchant silicon-based packet processing. While in open optical networking, we're separating the optical engine as embodied or contained in the transponder from the underlying optical line system. In both cases, though, network operators are seeking to have similar outcomes. They want greater choice, improved economics, and faster innovation cycles.
So a neat encapsulation there from Tim, and it seems like the aspirations are the same in that part of the network. Chris, do you feel like network operators will be inclined to mix and match in their data and optical networks as much as they will in their access networks?
Do you know, Ray, it takes us back to the last extra shot when we talked about the relationship between silicon, hardware and software and what's collapsing and what's opening up. And I think to the point just made in the comment there, in a sense, we have this contradiction again, this tension between the requirement for the economics to be right and the requirements for openness and vendor diversity. And I think, of course, we want to get absolutely the best possible underlying service to underpin all the access that we're talking about in this expanding and exploding market at the edge and out towards the customers. But we do need to have control over the economics as well as the technology. So I think there's a really interesting tension there between opening up as much as possible, and then what I suspect is happening is actually collapsing certain layers of the network together to create better economics and to improve performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that goes hand in hand with the virtualization trend as well. That's bringing some of those applications into the software realm. And Guy, is what's going on beyond the access networks as important as the developments in the RAN, for example? Should we be paying more attention to those kind of developments?
Oh, definitely. The RAN's enjoying the spotlight now, and so it should, and will no doubt continue to do so for many years. But let's not forget about the rest of the network. As Tim says, those three key points: choice, economics, and innovation. They're common across many parts of the network. And in fact, we've got a special DSP Leaders one-day summit at the end of May on open access, where we hope to discover more about that aspect of the telco network.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really interesting developments going on there, and have been for a few years. Now they're actually coming to fore and coming out into the actual production networks. Now, all of this begs the big question, which always comes up. If operators decide that they fancy multi-vendor open architectures, who's going to put it all together and manage all the piece parts? And can such Lego block networks be easily monitored and managed? This topic was raised on a number of occasions during the summit, but particularly during one of our live Q&A sessions, during which BT Chief Architect Neil McRae left no one in any doubt about how he feels. To paraphrase, he basically said that telcos need to focus on simplicity because complexity is the killer in telcos, and the more vendors you have, the more complexity you have. And that if anybody suggested that he builds an open network comprising technology from 50 or even just 5 vendors, he would run to the hills. And I think this is still a very big question in the industry. Ultimately, will open disaggregated networks be a massive pain to assemble, run and manage, and not actually provide the operational and economic benefits with which they are currently attributed? Chris, what are your thoughts here? Given what you said a few minutes ago, it sounds like you would have a few ideas on this.
Well, Ray, we touched upon it in the Great Telco Debate in December, didn't we? Where, the tension between, supplier diversity and efficiency of operation simplification. And I think Neil, of course, has a point. He's got to manage all this stuff. We see very different approaches, the degrees to which people have the integration skills in-house, the degrees to which they understand the moving parts. And of course, someone has to do that integration. Do we build it up from the integration done by specific vendors as they do that integration of their particular piece in the RAN, for example, or indeed collapsing some of the layers back in the sort of center core of the network? Or do we bring in third-party integrators? Certainly in many of the open network discussions, the systems integrators get very excited about the potential for their role in the future telco. And of course, the answer is it varies dramatically by organization. If they've got that skill set in-house, they've got that know-how in-house, then I believe they will gradually bring more and more of that into within their own walls. If they don't, perhaps for many of the smaller operators, then they will rely on other parties to do that integration for them and to create the simplicity. And we have to remember at the end of the day, we're trying to collapse an awful lot of technology down to underpin a service that delivers to you and I as consumers, or to businesses, or to the smart city sort of environment. So it's horses for courses. I think where you can control it, you should control it in-house as much as possible. Simplification will allow you to do that, but it differs very much by organization because of the legacy that they've had in place and depending on their ambitions for where they want to take it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you made that great point about, you always have to think about getting the service to the customer. I mean, that's the number one thing. That's what people pay for. So that needs to be right at the front of the thought process. And, quite often maybe we get buried away in the other discussions and forget that's where it needs to come out. And of course, that's where Neil's coming from. Really, during his time at BT, he said he's massively simplified, and the last thing he wants to do is to start adding complexity where he's taken it out in recent years. So, I mean, but also, like you said, horses for courses, there's going to be lots of different models out there. Hardly any two operators are going to have the exact same approach to this. And it's going to be really interesting to track them all and talk to them all in our future summits.
And Ray, I think one other point that I think is worth making on that is that the vendors who we think of as doing the integration, whether it's, you think of coming from the RAN or coming from the core or coming from the BSS and OSS side, all of those, as these digital building blocks become more open, and to your Lego analogy, then they can begin to bolt things on as well. So we can begin to integrate things together, not necessarily just from one particular element within the network. And therefore, if an organization does want to focus much more on the customer experience, then perhaps their integration partner is more likely to come from that part of the industry rather than from the more generic part of the industry. So there's a lot of players moving around trying to find their sweet spot and trying to match that with the sweet spot, as we said, for the different telcos and the way they want to build for the future.
Yeah, and I think we definitely see some companies with great aspirations to be those trusted partners bringing everything together. Well, I mean, I feel this topic is going to run and run, much like our discussion about what to do next with our Containerized Beverage Function leaderboard, which is getting even more out of control thanks to the massive support from our ecosystem for coffee. So, Guy, how's the leaderboard looking?
Well, we had hoped to basically overhaul the entire UI, but in true software project fashion, the work is running horribly behind schedule and obviously extremely over budget. So come back next program and we'll see if we manage it or not. However, as you can see, the board is pretty much maxed now with our 3 new inductees. And in case anyone has not been paying attention to the entire series of Extra Shot, the other category over there on the right-hand side comprises a Diet Coke and a hot chocolate.
You're suggesting that some people haven't been paying attention, or what are you talking about? Now, Chris, before we sign off this and pray for a new UI, but apart from the triple espressos at 10 p.m, what's keeping you up at night these days? What are the main topics of discussion when you're talking to the telcos?
Well, Ray, because I cover the range of everything around the telco and its future, it's many and varied. I'm delighted to see so much more around sustainability in its broadest context. There's a GSMA report coming out today on the climate action and energy action and so on. But I think the topic of automation and actually supporting the way customers want to do things, especially in this emphasis pushed upon the industrial side and the enterprise side of the business. So it's changed away from that consumer focus, which of course is still 60+% of the revenue, but moving towards that enterprise side. And can we build enough automation in? And actually that fits in with the simplicity question that Neil was touching upon as well. So just pretty much every aspect of what the telco is trying to do, but it's always drawn increasingly now towards what the customers are trying to do and that customer experience. And I think that in many ways, to your point you just made previously, we as an industry have focused on the individual pieces in the past, the building blocks, and the dynamics going on within the building blocks. Now is very much time, as the industry gets exposed to pressures from outside, is to see how those building blocks fit together, and of course how they may move around and be manipulated to actually deliver against the requirements of the customers at the outside. So it's a real mix of things, and I think it does make for a much more interesting role as an analyst, because it's not just about looking at the RAN, it's not just about looking at the core or looking at the relationship with the hyperscalers, but it's how the whole thing fits together, and ultimately, of course, how the sustainability of the industry, the long-term success of the industry. And by the way, while we're at it, I would just like to point out that earlier in your narrative, you talked about the coffee camp. Was that a slip? Did you mean Camp Coffee? Now, which decade are we going back to there? I'm very glad to say that I only ever smelt Camp Coffee and never had to taste it, because I think that was one for the trenches more than anything else. I think it was probably around the time of Chicory Tip. Yeah.
Right. Oh my. Fantastic. I'm glad we didn't get through an extra shot without some aging pop memorabilia references. Okay, well, great. Thanks for filling us in there, Chris. And of course, everything you talked about there, really, you can encapsulate all of that within the broader boundaries of the development of the digital service provider, which, of course, ultimately is what we're all about here at TelecomTV. Well, thanks for joining us today, Chris. And Guy, what's coming up next on the TelecomTV calendar? Are we taking the rest of the year off? I hope so.
Oh, hilarious. Fat chance of that, right? No, we are currently preparing our next DSP Leaders Summit on the topic of 5G evolution. And we'll broadcast that early next month. And we've got a great lineup of guests already to debate the issues that matter most to the industry. And we're also going to be taking a deeper dive into private 5G networks during that summit. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a one-day event on open access networks. And then we're going to follow that with our annual Edgeonomics Summit. Everything you wanted to know about Edge, but were afraid to ask. And then it gets really busy.
Oh, okay then. Well, I'll cancel my trip to the Arctic Circle then. Okay, well, thanks chaps for joining me today. We'll be back again very soon following the upcoming 5G Evolution Summit, which will be bringing a new set of faces and conversations to the world of digital discussions in mid-May. So it just leaves me to say thanks very much to Guy and Chris for joining me, and thanks to you for watching. Shots ahoy!